and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham-Fars incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we're here on the Dark Matter Digital Network. Our show lasts for a couple of hours, and I want to thank everyone that supports the show. You can listen to the whole show for $1 a month or more, or you can listen to the whole show live, or you can listen to the first hour as a podcast for free. And I want to thank supporters out there. A couple of people I want to shout out to. One is LOL Infected. I'm sorry, that's the only name I have for him. And another guy gave me his full name to use. That's Greg Galen. I want to thank him. Peter N., thank you. And there's many, many more. We have T-shirts that are the graphics are being made down in New York City, and hopefully they'll be done soon. And new T-shirts will come out. Everyone more or less did not like the old ones, so I'll be giving those away as we go along. And tonight's guest, I forgot to mention, we have Alejandro Rojas coming right up with the news in just a minute. But tonight's guest is Nick Redfern. We're going to talk about all different types of subjects. First of all, he's got a book, The Rh negative factor in blood, that is talked about in so many experiencers' cases, and is very interesting. There's really a connection there. So his new book is called Bloodline of the Gods, Unravel the Mystery in the Human Blood Type to Reveal the Aliens Among Us. Now, Nick, as you know, most people out there know, is a very prolific writer. He has 3 books out now. We're going to touch on a couple of them. In the second hour, we're going to be talking about his book, Men in Black. I think that's interesting, and a couple of other books he's done. And so that'll be coming up in a little bit. And now we have Alejandro Rojas with the news. How are you, Alejandro?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Good. You were under the weather. You're doing better. So I'm glad.
And I had bad tummy, but I have better tummy.
Good.
Not completely healed tummy, but better.
Good. Glad to have you
reminded me of some exciting news.
Oh, good.
That is that Nick Redfern's going to be speaking at the next UFO Congress.
All right. I get to meet him. Good.
Yeah. So last week I posted at least around half of our speakers that'll be there. An exciting list, and Nick Redfern is among them. So I'm real excited about that.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, pretty cool. Lots of really interesting stuff. And other news, last week I touched on that Puerto Rico thing, and I don't want to talk about it too much here because we already did. But I did want to add this interesting development, which is that we have heard from a couple of experts who work on those systems or are very familiar with those thermal imaging systems. In one case, the gentleman I had been going back and forth with worked on these things for thousands of hours. He's like a very high-level maintenance person with them, as high level as you can get. And he agrees with the analysis. He says that what is seen in this Puerto Rican UFO FLIR image is not a balloon, and it's nothing he's ever seen before. And his argument for it not being a balloon especially is that it's too hot. That, it's very dark in the image, which means it's a hot object, and it's way too hot, especially if you compare it to the heat signatures that you can see of the vehicles and planes that you can see in the background of this thing, that it's way too hot to be a balloon. So he doesn't think it could be that. And
that's great.
Yeah, so he agrees with the analysis, and he says it's one of the strangest things he's ever seen. He and his people around the office have been passing it around, and they're all pretty taken aback by it. So, yeah, some pretty positive stuff regarding that. Really interesting.
And you have your show this week is an interview with the people that have been researching this as well.
Yeah, normally that would have gone up on Monday. But I was sick the last couple of days in bed, rolling around in bed with fever and yuckiness. Yeah. But that is going up. That's gone up today. So I have an interview with the two of the researchers, Robert Powell and Morgan Bial, and we talk more about this. And they give a lot of interesting background that people don't know yet, which is a large part of all of this that I think people are going to find terribly interesting.
Great. So what else is happening?
What else is happening? Well, this is kind of a funny story, and I got lucky, and as I will sometimes when I'm looking for stories. This is a story written by Roger Marsh, MUFON's Director of Communication, but he also writes for us, and it's a story about bears. But what's funny about this, it's gotten the news, bears and UFOs, and it just looks like the media decided to pick up on the UFO thing because it's popular, and they said, study finds bears react to UFOs overhead. So it really isn't bears reacting to UFOs, but it is bears reacting to drones. So they wanted to know how much of a disturbance drones and things are to bears, and if they would even notice, because bears seem to not really pay attention to bugs and stuff like that.
Why bears, though? I mean, there's thousands of different animals in the forest. Why are they picking out bears to test this on?
Maybe because they're big predators that really don't have a predator that they fear, just to see how they would react. But they just noticed that they have a physiological response to UFOs. And, of course, the drone to them would be a UFO because they don't know what the hell that thing is flying around above them. But it's kind of a funny story. And I say I got lucky with the picture because I found this picture, and it's a real picture from this guy in Canada who was taking pictures, wildlife pictures, and a bear came up. So he ran into his car, and the bear, but he left his camera on the tripod with the zoom lens and everything, and the bear came up to his camera and stood up and looked into his camera. So it looks like this bear is looking through this camera. It's a really funny picture. It's a cool picture. But interesting enough, it's not too UFO related, but people just must love the fuzzy bears. So actually that story did pretty well. Lots of people were looking at that because it's kind of fun. But more down to business.
Okay.
UFO businesses. Roger also wrote something about a MUFON report that came in. And this is 3 triangular UFOs that were allegedly seen by a family in Alabama. So this guy says it was about 7 p.m. on August 10th when he was sitting out in the backyard, and he was looking up, and he sees a passenger jet. He estimated to be 27 to 30,000 feet high. And but then out of the peripheral of his eyes, he said he saw another object flying behind it that seemed to be following it. He looked more closely, and he said it looked to be like a triangular object without wings. He was so floored by this, he called his wife and had her come out to take a look too, and they were pretty shocked by the whole thing. They then talked to their son and told him about it, and he said, well, look towards my house in this direction because there's a couple more. And they said they did, and sure enough, they saw 2 more. So they say they saw 3 triangular-shaped UFOs.
Wow.
So, yeah, and this one of the witnesses, his background is he's worked with the Army and the military. He's had top secret clearances before, and he's worked on a number of different top secret type of defense projects and things. So he's a credible person. So it doesn't seem to be a hoax, and he feels he saw, 3 triangular UFOs.
Now, what is your opinion on that in the connection to military? Do you think there's possibly something out there the military has that they're... I mean, I go back and forth on it because I don't understand why they would fly in populated areas if they are testing something, but I don't know. There's so many triangle UFO sightings, it seems.
Well, that's the hard part, I think. I think we do and we don't. For instance, in the last couple of years, there have been some photographs taken of triangular-shaped aircraft that have contrails, and they don't appear to be stealth bombers or anything that we know of. So they appear to be testing of some sort of triangular-shaped plane. Now, these have contrails, which is, indicative of more conventional sort of propulsion systems. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the TR-3B, I felt that, and David Marler, who is now, I feel, an authority on triangular aircraft, he doesn't believe that exists. There's this legend of a TR-3B, anti-gravity triangular craft, and I've looked into this as well, and there is no evidence, just rumors. There was I think it was a TR-3A, which was a prototype. I don't even think they built it, but it was a stealth technology demonstrator type of thing. It was a concept sort of thing, but that's it. But nothing beyond that. So we don't have anything beyond that. There's, of course, the Aurora out there. There's a lot of people that feel the Aurora is real, and there are references to something called the Aurora, which is some sort of next step, craft. And then there are other, Popular Mechanics has written a lot about other possible past the SR-71, super stealthy, fast craft that can even break orbit that are, triangular shaped. So I'm sure the military and the private sector are working on, top secret triangular aircraft. But there's still a genuine mystery here because, if you look at David Marler's book, he has cases going back to the 1800s of triangular shaped craft. So yeah, it's really hard to say.
Yeah, there was a triangle sighting right over my house recently, which
really,
yes, I didn't see it, and I don't have the person's permission to talk about it really, but she drew me a picture of it and said, "What do you suppose this could be?" She said the lights didn't blink at all; they just stayed on, and
wow.
It was a perfect triangle with 5 lights. So I don't know. I started going out at night to see if I could see it again or whatever, But anyway, all interesting. Well, that's probably it. And I'm glad you're feeling better. Welcome back. And thanks so much for the news today.
All right. Thank you, man. Thanks for having me on again. And we'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you next week. And I will actually be at the Experiencer Speak coming up next weekend on the 28th and 29th. And I'm going to play this little commercial, and right after that will be a music break, and Nick Redfern will be coming right up. Hang in.
Starborn Support presents the 4th annual Experiencer Speak Conference, a UFO conference focused on the abductee experience phenomenon, featuring well-known speakers in the field. August 28th and 29th at Fireside Inn & Suites, Portland. There is no other conference just for and about experiencers. What you hear and see will leave you speechless. To register and find out more info, visit experiencerspeak.yolasite.com. Experiencer Speak Conference, Friday, August 28th and Saturday, August 29th. Fireside Inn & Suites, Riverside Street, Portland. That's experiencerspeak.yolasite.com.
Okay, we're back, and if you're listening live, feel free to jump over to podcastufo.com and jump in the chat room there. It's real easy sign up. And the phone number for call-ins, 603-967-4030. Nick Redfern, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, always. And I think you've been on a couple of times before in the past. And
yeah, I think 2 or 3, is it maybe? Something like that.
Right. And, my God, you write a lot of books. How many books do you write a year, Nick?
Well, I guess in a 12-month period, probably about 2.5, something like that.
Which is a lot. And well, for anyone who's, just from what I hear, for people who have written books, they just say there's so much involved. And I know you do a lot of research, and that must be, take up a lot of the time.
Well, to be honest, yeah, I mean, the research is probably the main part, and then the writing, when you've got all the information, the writing doesn't take too long. I mean, I like to sort of work regular hours. I like to do 8 to 5, Monday to Friday. I don't like working at night or weekends. And, of course, if you're working 8 to 5, Monday to Friday, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, you can get a lot done in that period. And so if you've got 4 or 5 months to write the book, or say 4 months, and you've got the bulk of your research done, it actually works out well. You just got to kind of structure yourself, and you just got to get down to getting it done.
I have a friend that's been self-employed forever, and he does very, very well at what he does, and it's just the discipline. He does, he has this beautiful cottage on a lake with sandy shore, and he only goes there on the weekend. He gets up every morning, goes to work, makes a complete day by himself, working hard all day long. That's all he does. I mean, I really congratulate anyone that has that type of discipline. It's really amazing.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you quickly get like a wake-up call that if you don't do that, it don't take long before, you get backed up and behind on things, and then the deadlines creep up on you. So, you really got to think about that, and like any sort of a self-employed job, project ahead as well. I don't want people to think it's just a job. For me, it's a passion as well.
Oh, yeah.
But even so, if you're writing and, you're with a publisher and they contractually give you a date to finish it by, you've got to finish it by then, whatever happens.
And so I was just going to ask you that, if they actually give you a deadline when to complete it. Now, do they edit the book afterwards? How does that, once you give them a manuscript, you hand it in, how long does it take before it actually hits the book stand?
Well, that's a good question, because it depends really on what books they might have coming round about the same time. For example, some publishers are quite relaxed and they just say, hey, just get it to us when you get it done, and they don't give you a cut-off time because they might have 5 or 6 other books they're working on. So, in other words, it's not like there's going to be a gap in their publications anyway. Now, say, for example, like with the Bloodline of the Gods book, which is out now, I mean, if they were putting out another sort of ancient astronaut book next month, they might well have said to me, hold off until December, because they wouldn't want to perhaps put out 2 books on the same subject, pretty much, within the same month. They try and stagger them. So, it depends on circumstances, what else they're publishing, how many more books they've got coming out that month. But, I mean, New Page, they prefer to have like a structured timeline of when you're going to submit it. But like most publishers, when you submit the Word document, the amount of editing that goes on is really dependent on, what you put into the original Word document. For the most part, of all the books I've done, it's just been a case of, asking a few questions. What does this mean? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What's the source of this, if I've forgotten to add one particular reference to the bibliography? In other words, it's nothing... It's not rocket science, it's just the sort of things you would expect that they might want to sort of have a question about or alter. But, I mean, I've never sort of been in a position of large-scale editing, where it comes back unrecognizable or anything like that at all. It's just literally words here and there, not even paragraphs or chapters,
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, so I do want to talk about Bloodline of the Gods, and then later on we can talk about some of your other books. But for the and also in the hour two, I'd like to talk about your book. I've always had a fascination with the Men in Black. I'd like to talk about that. So before we get started, though, on this particular book, just for the person that has not heard you before, most people have, but just for the person who hasn't, because since you've last been on the show, we have a lot of new listeners. So could you just give your background and what got you fascinated in the topic? I know that cryptozoology is a big thing of yours, kind of ahead of UFOs, if I remember, as far as being a passion of yours. That's what I remember from our podcast before. But go ahead if you would give a background.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right. Well, what got me interested, when I was a kid, probably about 6, my parents took me on a week's holiday to Scotland, and we spent a day at Loch Ness, and I still got a few fragments of memories of my dad telling me the story of the Loch Ness Monster. And when you're that kind of age, I guess you think of things like the Loch Ness Monster along the lines of, monsters under the bed or in the closet, it's just sort of a creepy story. But then as I got to sort of 12, 13, I picked up a few UFO books and things like John Keel, Brad Steiger, that kind of thing, and got into it more. Then when I left school in England, school leaving age in England is actually like 16 upwards. You don't. It's quite different to over here. You can leave school at 16 and just do what you want. And I actually wasn't that good of a student. I was sort of pretty bad, really. I was one of those who wanted to sit around doing nothing, unfortunately. But that was partly because I just wasn't a good student. I was like a late starter. And so I suddenly went from being, a kid at school to in the big wide world. And I was like, well, what are you going to do? And I just didn't have an idea, and actually looked around jobs that were being advertised in the town I was living in at the time. And just through pure luck, there was a new company that had been established in the same town, and they were looking to set up a new magazine called Zero, which would be for sort of teenagers, people in their 20s, and it would be fashion, Hollywood, celebrity stuff, gossip, interviews with TV people, rock stars, that kind of thing. And, it sounded cool. It didn't sound like a real job. It didn't sound like I've got to be stuck working in a bank all day in a boring old suit and having some guy telling me what to do, And so I took the interview and got the job, and they sort of trained me upwards from the basics of how to interview people, structuring articles, how to begin an article so it attracts the reader's attention, and pretty much everything I needed to know about getting into the writing business. And the job lasted a couple of years, and then I did writing freelance for a while, because this was when Britain was going through a recession at the time, and jobs were hard to come by. So I did a bunch of other jobs for a few years, but always did writing, on the background as well. And then when I was in my sort of mid-20s, I thought, well, it's like a now or never time. Sort of closer you get to 30, I think sometimes people feel it's too late to change things, and I didn't want to be in that position. So I just took a chance and I quit the job, and I was like, well, either you make it or you don't, but I'm going to do the best to work full-time as a writer. It was like being pushed in the swimming pool at the deep end. You either swim or you drown. And so I sort of learned, about the industry, the best people to contact, book publishers, magazines, newspapers, and then really sort of, you got to learn to basically be aggressive and pitch yourself and promote yourself and sell yourself. And the only way you can really do that is by coming up with marketable new stories and things that the magazines and the publishers are going to want to buy. So that's what really got me involved, and that was like 20 years ago, and I've done it ever since. But I do, like a lot of freelance writers, which is a very precarious job. You know, I think a lot of people assume that if you write UFO books, even one, you know, you're living in the Hollywood Hills and driving a Ferrari, which actually I can assure you is not the case. But it is like, I mean, don't get me wrong, if you can do a job that you really enjoy, that's a bonus. But freelance writing is a precarious job, and you need your wits about you. You need to project ahead months and stay on top of things. But if you can do that and you enjoy it, you know, you get the rewards from doing something that gives you satisfaction as well.
Yes. No, I agree with a lot of that. And, you know, I heard a saying, you know, success is loving what you have to do. And I really, you know, I really promote anyone that is trying to get to do their, you know, trying to do their passion, whatever it is, and, you know, sometimes the money comes along, you know, and usually it does if you're really, really into it. That's how I feel anyway.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, you know, I earn a living from the subject, but, I mean, people might find it interesting, you know, if they want to get into this field, that probably only about 30% of my income does come from the book writing. The rest just comes from mainstream journalism, newspaper, magazine work, and I also do editing and proofreading services for other authors as well, and often on, you know, just subjects having nothing to do with the paranormal at all. And so, you know, it's sort of a combination. It's a job in writing, but it's a combination of widely sort of varying different subjects.
Yeah. I think there is, I've talked about it a number of times on this show, that there is a little bit of a misconception that, you know, people think just because you see someone like yourself. I've seen you on many documentaries on the History Channel, and, you know, you're all over the screen. You're not exactly getting rich from that either.
Well, no, I mean, most TV shows, you know, they have a set fee, which isn't a bad fee, but, you know, you may only do the show once a year, you know, that kind of thing, and you do somebody else's show a year. And again, you know, I mean, I enjoy doing them because sometimes you get to travel to on-location shoots, places you've never been before, so it's sort of like a cool road trip experience as well as doing the TV show, which I enjoy, you know. But yeah, I mean, for me, so I do a lot of work in the music industry as well, and I kind of draw an analogy between people who write books and bands. You know, it's like if you're busy as a band, you can earn a living on the road because today, you know, with downloads, CDs don't sell as much as they used to, you know, so bands have to earn another way. And if you're busy and you keep on top of things, you can earn a living. But it's only, you know, a few bands that actually kind of reach the position of, just major sellouts, etc. You know what I mean? It's that sort of most bands kind of go along at a certain level. Then every so often you'll find one that sort of shoots up to number one, and they're gigantic, and they maintain that for years until it's time for them to get off. You know. Yeah. And I kind of sort of equate that with writing. It's an unpredictable business, but for me, I enjoy the unpredictable aspect of it because you never really know what might happen and what can happen, and the doors it can open. So I would always say to people, if they, you know, I always say to people, I think everybody has got a story in them, a book, or, you know, there's always something that happens in somebody's life that would lend itself to a book. And people say, well, how do you start it? I said, well, you know, you just write it down as it happened and go back and look at it the next day, and you often think then, oh, I'll change that. It would look better if I did this. And it's, you know, like I said, you don't have to be Einstein. I mean, I'm a good example. I mean, I could tell you I went to college, university, got all these big degrees. I didn't. I walked out of school at 16, and what are you going to do? You know, you do what you're going to do. So anybody can do it, you know. That's right.
Well, that's, yeah. I wouldn't say anybody, but I think, you know, I don't think education always means. Now, I may be insulting someone that, you know, really went to a lot of schooling, but education doesn't always mean that someone is really successful at something. You know, I know someone that made it to the 9th grade, and you know, he sold his company recently for $240 million. So that's not too bad.
Well, you know, actually, you make a good point there because, I mean, you know, I'm not saying education isn't important because it is, but I mean, I've run across people who've gone from school to college to university, and they become teachers and they go back to school, and they haven't really seen much of the big wide world. You know, as I said, I left school at 16, and I was sort of on the road interviewing bands at 17 backstage. You know, I was thrust into the big wide world quickly, and I enjoyed it. You know, and I was sort of traveling around here, there, and everywhere. You know, you get expenses given to you. You know, well, you got to book your flight and all this business. And you know, to do that at 16, you know, it's like jumping into something new. But for me, it was good because you don't just learn about, you know, taking your own responsibility, but you also learn quickly that what the big world's like. And sometimes I think when people are encased in just, you know, going from school to university and then straight into a job and not seeing the world around them, you know, it's kind of living in almost like a glass house. You don't see what's going on outside, or you don't experience it. And that's one of the good things about writing and things like this. You do get to sort of diversify and, you know, experience this and see that.
And how did you end up in the U.S.?
Well, actually, I got a job offer. I've lived in the U.S. for about 15 years, and actually got a job offer. As I said, I do contract research for authors, and it was basically like that. And it was a 1-year contract, and then rolled over into a 3-year one. And a lot of it was based around the Dallas area where I moved to, and as I said, I've been here 15 years, and, you know, I like it over here, and did all the legal stuff, and, you know, officially emigrated, just in case Donald Trump's listening. And, you know, did all that paperwork, which, you know, for me, I think it's the right thing to do. If you're going to come to somebody else's country and live, you know, you abide by their regulations, and yeah, you know, I like it over here. I live in the Dallas area still, and we're just outside Dallas. And so basically that's what brought me over. And like I said, that was about 15 years ago.
Okay, so let's talk about your book. Before we start, Matthew, I'm not sure where he is. He's in the chat room every single time. He has been for several months, and he is always asking this question about the Rh negative factor. So hopefully he'll catch the podcast if he's not available on this, because I knew if he was going to be in the chat room, he'd have a million questions for you. So the book is, the short title to it is Bloodline of the Gods. And I'm trying to read, what is the tagline is Unravel the Mystery of the Human Blood Type to Reveal the Aliens Among Us.
Yeah, so, new page. Enjoy having like long subtitles.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how did you get interested in this topic? And it is such a, it's kind of a topic you wouldn't normally think about. And the only reason I have thought about it at all is because, again, from this guy named Matthew that's in the chat room, he's always talking about it. He has a great interest in the connections of abductees as well. So, let's hear about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. It is kind of an obscure subject, and for the most part, in terms of the UFO research field, it has sort of gone under the radar for a long time. Now, you know, if you Google Rh negative blood, you can find a lot of just regular medicine-based stories, you know, at hospital sites, doctors, medical sites, that kind of thing, which will give you a lot of just straightforward background on the Rh negative situation. And occasionally, you know, you'll drop on one that relates to the UFO subject. Now, one of the things I always look for when I'm writing a book, you know, if people are going to buy your book, you want to be able to give them value for money and give them something new. I mean, I could tell you some horror stories about some well-known authors who just have total disregard for their audiences, and I've almost come to fist fights with a couple of them. I mean, literally, because they're like, well, they'll buy my books because it's my name. It doesn't really matter. Huh. To me, that's wrong. You've got to show your audience respect because they're the people buying your books. The only reason I'm able to do what I do is because, I'm fortunate enough for people. They buy the books, and I appreciate the fact that they do, and I want to be able to give something back, whether it's hanging out, over a beer at a conference or, at a lecture, or just by, signing an autograph or whatever. And so that comes back to the issue of when I'm looking for a new book, you want to give the person a set value for money and could try and come up with something new rather than regurgitating old stuff. And so I was looking around for ideas that were sort of a little bit untouched, but were known to a degree at least. And one of the things that popped up was the whole issue of, Rh-negative blood. And to a degree, I stumbled upon it sort of by accident from the perspective of hearing a few stories, like online, or seeing stories online, or, listening to them at conferences, where a few people said, I got Rh-negative blood and ABC, etc., etc. And then I realized that, well, that's another person who's Rh-negative and another. So I literally one day I just Googled Rh-negative blood plus UFO. It was that simple, and found a few leads here and there, researched it further, and then started putting the word out a little bit and interviewing more people and more people. And I realized that it was actually not just a minor, obscure aspect. It was actually a large aspect, and is a large aspect of the subject, but very few people have been talking about it. It's kind of like the whole issue, like the elephant in the room, It's there in front of us, but it hardly ever gets touched upon. And then I thought, well, it's time to do something about that and sort of readdress the situation, and that's what prompted me to do it.
And so let's talk about, well, first of all, there's a question that someone sent me an email today, and they had a question they wanted me to ask you, and that is it possible for Rh-positive parents to give birth to an Rh-negative child?
Yes, it actually is. I actually know someone who falls into that category. There are risks with having an Rh-negative parent, excuse me, and an Rh-positive parent, and I'll explain why that is. If you have, say, an Rh-negative father and Rh-positive mother, when the fetus starts to grow, there can actually be no problems at all. Now, a lot of people don't realize that although, the unborn baby actually gets its nourishment from the mother's bloodstream and the bloodstream of the fetus, they don't cross, they don't mix, they're actually kept separate. However, if there are sort of few concerns about the fetus and, they have this procedure where a needle is inserted to allow them to take blood from the fetus to check it all out, if during that process a little bit of that blood gets into the mother's bloodstream, what's very weird is that the Rh-positive mother, her entire body recognizes the negative blood as being foreign and essentially alien and deadly, and the mother's body literally tries to kill the unborn fetus.
Right.
And that can be extremely dangerous, to the point where, fortunately today, we have drugs that will combat that. But in the past, the baby would be at major risk. At the very least, it can cause severe anemia because the mother's body actually prevents the baby from absorbing all the nourishment. And so they become like the equivalent of like a young anorexic girl who doesn't eat, but they're not eating deliberately. It's the mother's body trying to shut down the fetus. So in other words, that is one of the strangest things about being Rh-negative versus positive, is that the Rh-negative baby is viewed as alien, no pun intended.
Now, so getting back to that question, so if two Rh-positive parents can give birth to an Rh-negative, how does that fit in with your theories in this book?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because, there's the whole issue of Rh negative parents versus, an Rh negative baby, it demonstrates that sometimes, this can happen at random. But the reason why I wrote the book is because when you study the Rh negative phenomenon overall, we find a higher percentage of Rh negatives who are either abductees, contactees, or have had profound UFO experiences. So, in other words, even if some of these events appear to occur at random, there are unanswered questions as to why that might happen. But even if that does happen, we still see, sort of like a greater level of people who are into this subject. And so that's what leads me to believe that being Rh negative is not just a matter of, being different to an Rh positive person. There's something else going on, even at a mindset level where the people feel driven and drawn to this subject.
Wow, okay. So if you're listening live, you can jump into the chat room at podcastufo.com and ask a question, or you can call in at 603-967-4030. A lot of people are listening right now, Nick, but we get very few calls, so just letting you know. But
oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Now, can you kind of explain the book in general, and and go over some of the bullet points of the book as far as the connection of possible aliens?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Well, just so as people understand, because it'll sort of lead into it, help them understand the nature of it. If I just give you a quick rundown on what Rh negative blood actually is and what it means. Now, somewhere in the region of sort of 85 to about 90% of the population is Rh positive. So it's about sort of 10 to 12% that is Rh negative. Now, Rh stands for rhesus, as in the rhesus monkey. And essentially, an Rh positive person, there are 4 types of blood, AB, and O. And those classifications come from what are called the antigens of a person's blood cells. And antigens are proteins that are found on the surface of cells to combat bacteria and viruses. Now, those antigens, those proteins, if you have those, you're Rh positive. The Rh negatives don't possess any of those proteins that the rest of us have. So this begs the question, if the theory of evolution is 100% correct, why is it that a small percentage of the population has such radically different blood to the others? And why should they have this UFO connection to a greater degree, percentage-wise, than the rest of the population? So that's when we have to sort of try and figure out why that should be. And this gets to what you said about the theme and the bullet points. One of the things I point out is that although 10 to 15% of the population's Rh negative, there's actually one group of people where it rises from anywhere between about 45 and 55%, and that's what's called the Basque people of Spain, B-A-S-Q-U-E. And as I said, their figures are like 45 to 55%. Well, the Basque people have a unique language which is not totally unknown anywhere else in Europe. It's so weird and strange. It doesn't resemble any other European language. And it's been suspected that it's like a modern-day equivalent of a very ancient language. One of the theories is that it's actually the language of Cro-Magnon man, because superficially at least, the Basques are probably the closest living relative to the Cro-Magnons. They resemble them in certain ways. They have like a larger forehead, more prominence. Their bodies are more bulky. And the areas where the Basques are prominent are also the areas where Cro-Magnon man proliferated. Now, there are other areas of the planet where there are Cro-Magnons, and there's a higher percentage of Rh negatives in those areas, in the same way where the Basques live in France and Spain. There's a higher percentage of Rh negatives there, and Cro-Magnon man live there, which is almost like a solid indicator that Cro-Magnon man was also Rh negative. And this then leads into the issue of why Cro-Magnon man should have been Rh negative and possibly not the Neanderthals or some of the other types of human. And from there, that leads into the theories postulated by various people who studied the ancient aliens angle, that was Cro-Magnon man genetically manipulated in the distant past, possibly to be some sort of slave species? And if it was it modified to be sort of more of a robust worker-type entity? And did that involve making it Rh negative? Because there are indications that Rh negatives have a greater resistance to certain viruses and diseases. They have slightly lower blood pressure, which is good. You know, if your blood pressure is slightly lower than normal, that's actually good for your heart and everything. So in other words, it's the issue of, was somebody in the distant past trying to refine an early human species, and as a result, did they create some sort of Rh negative entity, if you like?
Wow. Now, so you're saying that there's maybe 12% of the U.S. population, and so what is the connection to UFOs? I mean, I would think that if someone's filling out a UFO report, for one, that blood type is nothing that they would, indicate. But so how would you do some research as far as this goes?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of it stems from the fact that, the more the story gets out there, the more people come forward and say, hey, I'm Rh negative. And the percentage who come forward demonstrates, I mean, it's not like it's the majority of the population who get abducted, it's not the majority of the human population get abducted in the first place, but when we find a larger percentage are Rh negative, people who read about this because they want to learn more about their experiences, they then realize that, hey, I'm not alone, there are other Rh negatives. So in other words, a lot of this comes through word of mouth and people relating their stories, and there's clearly, a larger percentage. Now, one of the intriguing things that demonstrates a link between abductions and the Rh negative issue is that many of the Rh negatives, certainly a higher percentage than average, are born with an extra vertebra in their back. Now, that can happen at random. It's actually not, that uncommon an anomaly, and most people may not even know unless they have to have back surgery. But the percentage is higher in Rh negatives. Now, what's really interesting, keeping that in mind, is if we go back to probably the most famous alien abduction story of all, the Betty and Barney Hill case of 1961. Well, when the Hills had their encounter, obviously there was no real talk at that time of alien abductions, but they recalled missing time, being taken on board some sort of craft, started to get nightmares and bad dreams, and realized that something weird had happened in that missing time. So they decided to go and undergo regressive hypnosis. Now, keep in mind this issue of the extra vertebra in the Rh negatives. Well, Barney Hill, when he was under hypnosis, said that when he was on board this craft, the presumed aliens did something very weird. He said they were running their fingers down his spine slowly and carefully, and it made him wonder if they were counting his vertebra, which, bear in mind, nobody was talking about extra vertebra and aliens and Rh negative blood and abductions in 1961. And yet it was in the immediate aftermath of 61 that Barney was talking about all this. So, that's one of the first things. I've also got a chapter in the book about what are known as MILABs, sort of military abductions, where abductees who have been abducted by, again, presumed extraterrestrials have later been abducted by what sounds almost like rogue military agencies, like shadow agencies, and asked a lot of questions about their blood. What type of blood do you have? Things like this, suggesting that somebody at an official level, or, as I said, at a rogue level outside of the government, seems to know something about this, and they're targeting abductees as well.
Wow. Yeah. So as far as people that are abducted, I know Denise Stoner and Kathy Martin, the niece of Betty Hill, have a questionnaire for the similarities between abduction cases, and I'm not sure if the blood type is in that, but I'm going to see Kathy next week I'm going to ask her about that and ask her what her thoughts are on that subject. Did you speak to anyone like her that does any abduction research?
Yeah, actually did. I mean, a classic example and right up to date is Mike Cleland. I don't know if you know Mike, but Cleland. Mike Cleland. He's done a huge amount of research into abductions, and particularly from the perspective of how a lot of abductees have said that they seem to have scream memories of seeing owls. That's to say, they know something weird's happened, but they can't consciously recall the abduction experience, but they have this sort of weird memory of seeing like a large owl stood at the side of the road.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Mike has hypothesized the idea that, he's actually got a book coming out on it shortly, hypothesized that these could be screen memories created by extraterrestrials to give like a down-to-earth explanation to hide what really happened. Now, bear in mind, Mike has dug deeply into these phenomena and had experienced a lot of weird synchronicities as well when he's been doing this research. And so not long ago, he decided to get his blood checked, and it turns out he's Rh negative as well. And so, here's a guy who's at the forefront of research into abductions, looking into some really interesting alternative issues like the owl camouflage angle, and he suddenly finds out he's Rh negative. Other examples, one of the chapters I have in the book is on a controversial issue known as inherited memory. It's like if you're a child or and you look at your parents, you can see traits from your father and your mother in you. Same with brothers and sisters and things like that. Well, there's another theory that, to a degree, and encoded deep in our DNA and our subconscious, that fragments of actual memories can be passed down as well. Now, that's not been proved, of course, but what's interesting, as I point out in this particular chapter in the book, I mentioned about how certain people who are Rh negative feel driven to the UFO subject, but they don't know why. Again, it is like something's encoded in their mind. And I don't think for that reason that it's coincidence that several of the major figures within ancient astronaut research are Rh negative. For example, Eric von Daniken is Rh negative. He's sort of, the leading or the most well-known ancient astronaut author. Granted, there were authors before him, like Raymond Drake and Maurice Jessup, who wrote about ancient aliens, but certainly Chariots of the Gods, written by von Daniken in 1968, was the one that really brought it to, the world. So he's Rh negative. Brad Steiger, who's written extensively on ancient mysteries, Atlantis, the pyramids, ancient astronauts, he's Rh negative. Robert Anton Wilson, who's now deceased, but in the 70s, he believed he was having sort of contactee channeling conversations with extraterrestrials, some of which were based around ancient mysteries connected with the Egyptians. That's just 3 examples of a number where people at the forefront of looking into ancient mysteries just happen to be Rh negative.
Wow. And being such a small percentage, that does mean something. Is it just the absence of a particular antigen that makes Rh negative?
Well, yeah, pretty much, yes. But it's not so much, what they lack that defines them as Rh negative. That is the reason, that they're called Rh negative. But it's the sort of the profound differences that just that one issue seems to provoke. As I said, a higher resistance to viruses. There are other weird issues as well, like less tolerance to sunlight, direct sunlight. For some reason, I've spoken to a lot of Rh negative people, some of whom have no involvement in the UFO subject, and exposure to sunlight, a lot of them complain rashes and hives on the shoulders and neck particularly, more than anywhere else. And as I said, there's this issue of slightly lower than normal blood pressure. Many of them feel driven towards sort of spiritual issues, not sort of necessarily organized religion, but just the idea of, focusing on something bigger out there. And as I said, the main thing is the UFO issue and the spillover there with abductions as well. So in other words, to get back to your point, yes, it's the whole issue of the lack of this protein that defines them. But the weird thing is why then that should cause all these other spin-offs to occur as well.
Right, right. When you were doing your research, if you haven't already talked about it, was there one thing in particular that really stood out as really fascinating to you?
Well, I think the one thing for me, and this sort of lends itself to further research, is how, you know, the abduction phenomenon, which I think is connected to all this because, you know, you have the whole genetics angle, is the way in which the abduction phenomenon has sort of developed.
Hang on just a minute. Sorry, Nick. We have a caller who just called in. Caller, please say your name and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Martin. It's Matthew. I had to work late tonight, so I just used the phone.
Well, I'll tell you what, I was talking about you earlier because I thought you'd have a bunch of questions for Nick, and you're on with Nick now, so go ahead and ask away.
Sure. I want to make a general comment. I posted in the chat room a few weeks back. For those of you who are interested in knowing your blood type, I was surprised when I asked my doctor, who does blood work on me all the time, who declined to tell me what my blood type is, stating they didn't know, and saying insurance wouldn't pay for it, and it would cost me $100 to find that. Oh. But the alternate way is donate your blood, and they have to tell you. So
okay.
That's how I found out I am O negative.
Well, actually, you know, that's interesting that you're interested in all this subject and you're O negative. O negative, I'm sure you know, is known as the universal donor because you know, if you're A group or B group or AB, you have to have that sort of blood injected into you, you know, to be okay. However, anybody can be injected with O negative because, as I said, it's called the universal donor. And so, in that sense, you know, you've got a really unique type of blood coupled with an interest in UFO phenomena.
Have you studied the research where they claim that Rh negative cannot be cloned at all?
No, I actually haven't, no.
Okay. And then I just have a couple other commonalities that I found from my research in Rh negative. I have low body temperature. My core temperature is typically 96.8 to 97.3. I'm very sensitive to heat. I sweat profusely from my head. And another thing is I get startled very easily. People like walk around a corner, I'll just get really, really taken back. I'm easy to startle, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I don't know if you heard the show earlier, but I was actually talking about the lack of sensitivity, or oversensitivity, excuse me, to sunlight, and also low blood pressure, and that actually ties in as well with like low body temperature and a lower than normal pulse rate, which actually is nothing to sort of worry about. It's a good sign for the most part, providing you don't have any underlying conditions. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting you've called in and you actually demonstrated you've got some of those characteristics.
So, Matthew, we met actually out in Phoenix originally, but you've been posting something in the chat room about Rh negative blood almost anytime the abduction comes up or anything like that. So what got you interested in that, and you must have done some research on that.
Well, it is part of, you were talking momentarily about Kathleen Martin. On her commonality list, it's listed there, and it just comes up again and again. So it was just a synchronicity with me, and I was trying to discover why I sweat so much, and I did a lot of research, and that's what led me to look into myself.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, thank you very much. You know, we're getting right up to the top of the hour. So thanks for calling in, Matthew, and we'll see you back in the chat room.
You bet. Bye.
Bye. So we're still on, aren't you, Nick?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because I've had some trouble before with this phone system. It's all through Skype. But anyway, we're right at the top of the hour, so next hour we're going to talk about Men in Black and some of your other books. And so if you hang on just one moment, we'll be right back right after this quick music break. Remember, you can jump into the chat room at podcastufo.com and hang on. We'll be right back. So music is provided by a couple of fans of the show, Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse, and that was by Bruce Renier. And welcome back. Here we go. Let's just jump right in and talk about the Men in Black, because that's unless there's some more you want to touch on in this your latest book.
Yeah, that's totally fine. The Men in Black.
Okay. So I've always been fascinated. Now I didn't get a chance to read your book on the Men in Black, but what is the connection there? Why and who have you come up with an idea of who these people are?
Well, it gets kind of confusing because I think, as strange as it sounds, there could be several categories of Men in Black. Funnily enough, that you should bring it up because I actually have a new book coming out on the Men in Black. This will be the third one I've done in about 3 weeks' time. And funnily enough, it's called The Men in Black. And this... Basically, this is probably when it comes to UFOs, that's probably my favourite subject to investigate. It's one I'm particularly interested in because there are so many different angles to it. Now, I guess for most of the general public, when they think of the Men in Black, they think of Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith, you know. Mm-hmm. That's how it's become sort of like such an iconic thing. And a lot of people I know, speaking to them outside the UFO field, they actually think the story of the Men in Black actually didn't exist before the movies. They don't realise that the term Men in Black goes back to the 50s, and the reports go back to the 40s and even earlier. So, in other words, you know, it's a long-standing issue. But what the movies did was to portray the Men in Black as sort of agents of some sort of shadow government that operated outside of the regular government, and most people didn't know about it. You know, you were recruited into it, and for want of a better term, they were secret agents. The reality is that I would say close to 100% of the reports do not fall into that category. Most people who see the Men in Black report them as being sort of 5 foot to 5'5" tall, very pale, almost like to the colour of milk, you know, looking deathly sick white. They wear these old-style fedora hats. Their clothes kind of hang on them. And they often wear these large wrap-around black sunglasses. When people got close to them, they seem to have these bulging eyes, like over-staring eyes. And they don't seem conversant with our ways and mannerisms, and they don't really know how to operate in our environment, suggesting that they're some sort of alien thing themselves, which, you know, isn't an impossibility. But that's given rise to the idea, could they actually be some sort of hybrid, you know, between, quote, us and them? The idea that, you know, that they wear these fedoras and black sunglasses and largely only come out at night to essentially camouflage themselves, which, if that hypothesis is genuine, it would actually make a lot of sense. The idea of, you know, these things coming out at night, and they look like us. But if you looked a little bit too close, you would see some weird abnormalities. But, you know, most people have got their heads in their iPhones when they're walking around, and if they're coming out at night, you know, they could get away with it. Now, but what's weird is that I have actually a few cases on record where Men in Black have turned up at people's homes and there's been no UFO connection at all. You know, the witnesses haven't seen a UFO, haven't been abducted, but they've been dabbling in Ouija boards and the occult. And they've experienced like violent poltergeist activity in the home, and like an overpowering smell of sulfur or brimstone, which is like a classic odor associated with paranormal and occult activity. And so in other words, what sounds like, you know, for most people initially like secret agents out of some sort of episode of the X-Files actually becomes a phenomenon which is tied to all different aspects of the paranormal and has a great deal of occult overtones attached to it.
Now, someone has a question up on the message board, and I'll ask that in just a second. But I want to ask kind of an obscure question about this. Is there any connection? You also hear about black helicopters.
Yeah.
Has there ever been any connection with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are some cases where people have had visits from the Men in Black, and then afterwards they've had sort of black helicopters hovering over their homes. They've had telephone interference, mail delayed and opened and resealed, but resealed in a way that clearly, you know, they want the person to know, or somebody wants the person to know that the mail was opened. You know what I mean? It's like a form of intimidation. But yeah, I mean, I know of a number of cases where people were visited by Men in Black and then had the black helicopters. But bizarrely, I've got a small number of black helicopter cases where the people said they saw the black helicopter and then it kind of shimmered and changed into a UFO, as if the black helicopter image was almost like a stealthy form of camouflage or sort of a holographic image projected around a UFO. So that gets, you know, that pushes it down an even stranger path then.
Wow. We have a listener who's on now in the chat room. He's also from England, and he's saying, what are the Men in Black driving these days? It always used to be black Cadillacs in the U.S. and black Jaguars in the U.K.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, as weirdly as it sounds, I still get reports today of people seeing the Men in Black in like the old 1950s cars, you know, that you would, like Cadillacs that you would see in some, you know, some 1950s gangster movie, like some black and white gangster movie. They still drive those. And what's weird is you would imagine that the Men in Black would do their utmost to not be noticed, but everything about them does draw people's attention to them. You know, the clothes, the old-style clothes and the fedora hats, the old cars. Now, some of that may be done for effect to, you know, create intimidation and fear, and that it probably works on a lot of people, I would think. But again, you know, we have no real answer as to why that should be the case. And I mean, again, this takes things down really strange paths. I've got at least 20 reports, I know, of people who said they saw the Men in Black turn up in this old black car, and the car vanished, like it faded away. Oh. Or again, like the helicopter, it shimmered and vanished, as if almost the Men in Black were trying to project imagery into the person's mind of a more down-to-earth nature, when actually something else was going on. You know, the best analogy I can think of is sort of like in the Matrix movies, you know, where we find out that Keanu Reeves' character and everybody else, we're all sleeping in these tanks and, you know, we're providing food for the machines, and the real world around us actually isn't the real world around us. It's sort of a projection into our minds. And that's what some of the stories people tell about the Men in Black. It's almost as if, yes, they get the visit from the Men in Black, but the other aspects of it are sort of created and instilled in the person's mind to provoke certain imagery, like the cars and the helicopters, when in actual fact the person may be in like a semi-trance-like state, not realizing it.
Now, Howard Hughes, he's a great paranormal radio host in England. The listener is posting that he claims that he had an encounter directly with Men in Black himself. Are you aware? I know you're connected with a lot of people in the UFO field, and you're friends with a lot of other people. Do you have any connections with someone that directly had a Men in Black experience?
Oh, God, yeah, I know, I would say 40 or 50 people. I mean,
really? Wow.
The new book that comes out in a couple of weeks, that contains about 30 or 40 chapters, About 25 of those are from witnesses in their own words, which have never been published before. And, everybody's named, and so that's 25 people who've had personal experiences. In my previous book, The Real Men in Black, I probably included 40 or 50 in there, and I probably have somewhere in the region of 15 or 20 cases from people who told their stories but didn't ever want them publishing. They want to sort of stay in the background and not have any publicity or even have the story told, but generally you contacted me because they were looking for some sort of input or help as to what happened to them. They're like, well, can you explain what happened, but please don't do anything with it. If people ask me or tell me not to publish something, I don't. But yeah, I've got quite a few sort of silent cases in the background. And then you find other researchers, Tim Beckley. Tim has been collecting reports for years, same with Brad Steiger. These reports are sort of so prevalent, but what's weird is that no one ever catches the Men in Black. Again, it is almost like, as I said, the experience occurs in a sort of a dream state. And some researchers do wonder if the Men in Black, so strange as it sounds, if they ever really do turn up at people's doors, or if the whole thing is some sort of highly advanced projection from the almost like something inserted into, a program. You download a program on your laptop or whatever, and you run the program. Some people think it's along those lines, that the Men in Black are basically a program that is dispatched, and they're not sort of living, self-aware creatures. They're like a 3D hologram created by some vast program that can be inserted into our reality. And that sort of then begs the question, well, what is reality? Are we seeing it as it really is, or is it just our version of reality?
Wow. That's really mind-blowing stuff. Now, I think, I don't know about you, but if Men in Black showed up at my door, I would feel like I'd have to start laughing. I don't know. I'd be like, you got to be kidding me type of thing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the questions people often say to me, well, if the Men in Black turn up at the door and you look through your spy hole and you see three creepy little guys with white skin and 5 feet tall and weighing about 120 pounds at midnight, you sure as hell aren't going to let them in. But people do. So, in other words, what happens, people like us now, you can talk about this and we can have a laugh and a joke even about what would you do if they turned up on the doorstep. But when it actually happens, it's as if the Men in Black are able to take away the person's common sense factors.
Wow.
You imagine sometimes when you're in bed, you have a dream, and when you're having the dream, it's normal. When you wake up, you think, well, that was a really weird dream, but it didn't seem weird when you were dreaming it, Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like with the Men in Black. People are placed into this state where they don't see anything strange about opening the door at midnight, and then these three creepy little guys file in, very often weirdly in a line after the other, and they sort of shuffle along like conveyor belt style or something. And they come in, they sit down, and they start threatening the person and asking them questions. And the person sits there and answers the questions. Then when the Men in Black are finished, they leave. And then it's like the person starts to come round from anesthetic, and, they start to get their faculties back to normal. And then they realise the sheer danger of what they did. They let in three strangers at midnight and grilled them. And there's another aspect to all this as well, that when the interrogations, which is the only way you can really describe them, when the interrogations are going on, a number of the witnesses have said that one of the Men in Black, they usually come in threes, one of the Men in Black asks the questions, and the other two sort of have their eyes are just constantly, never blinking, and just boring into the eyes and the face of the witness. They're just sitting there staring at them. And the witnesses have said on many occasions, as these Men in Black have been staring at them, they've started to feel weak. And one of them described it as like how a diabetic would probably feel if they started crashing, if they'd missed a couple of meals. And then they go into sort of emergency mode and the body starts to shut down. They get the shakes and everything. That's what a lot of witnesses to the Men in Black have said. And they actually felt that the Men in Black were almost like psychic vampires, not like in the movies and folklore of draining us of blood, but possibly sort of like psychic parasitic creatures that thrive on human energy. They bleed us dry of energy. And what's interesting about that is, as I said, when the men in black come to the door, you know, they don't try and force their way in. They wait to be invited. They have to be invited. And that ties in very much with, again, the old vampire law, that a vampire has to be invited the first time it comes into your home. So I do wonder if some of these old vampire legends could actually have been early visits by men in black that became changed into something else. You know, there's not much difference between, in the 1800s, somebody claiming to be visited by a black-cloaked, white-faced vampire that demanded to be let in or asked to be let in, and a black-suited, pale-faced man in black today. There's actually not much difference, really, when you look at the stories.
Mm-hmm. How about that? A question up on the message board. Have you ever heard of the Hat Man? And if so, do you think they're related to Men in Black?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually do believe they're related. A good friend of mine, Heidi Hollis, wrote a book about the Hat Man called The Hat Man. And a lot of people, as I said, think, you know, the Men in Black are like government agents, but they're clearly not. Now, in some of these cases of the Men in Black, even when they have these fedoras on and the suits, they don't look like fully formed. They're almost sort of shadowy and semi-spectral, as strange as it sounds. And this ties in with what's a phenomenon that's become quite popular and prevalent in the last few years of what are called shadow people, which typically turn up in people's bedrooms when they're sleeping, and they wake up, they find themselves unable to move properly or at all, and they see these shadowy figures in the room. Now, some of these shadow people, as oddly as it sounds, have these black fedoras on, like the Men in Black do. And so this has led to the creation or the identification of a subcategory of the shadow people called the Hat Man. And the Hat Man is actually almost like indistinguishable from some Men in Black reports. And I do think they are all connected. I think they're all different aspects of one phenomenon, perceived in different ways by different people. And some people, you know, think they haven't been visited by a Man in Black, and they think they've been visited by the Hat Man because they assume, well, the Men in Black are government agents, and it wasn't a government agent. They don't realize the reality of the MIB. So, yeah, I think the Hat Man, this sort of, which are quite sort of predatory, evil type characters that, you know, as I said, crop up in people's bedrooms. And again, there's some evidence in some cases that they act in sort of like a psychic, supernatural vampire type way, sort of draining people of their life force and energy, and people waking up exhausted in the morning, that kind of thing. Almost like I guess what some people might call like a demonic attack, that kind of thing. But I also think it ties in with things like the black-eyed children, which has surfaced, you know, in the last decade or so. I mean, you look at the black-eyed children; they look like children equivalent to the Men in Black. They're pale, skinny. They typically wear black hoodies. You know, the Men in Black wear black hats. The black-eyed children wear black hoodies. They largely come out at night. They try and force their way or get into people's homes. That's one of the typical aspects of the black-eyed children stories. So I think somewhere, you know, there's a direct connection between all of these cases. And one book I'm slowly working on bit by bit, and it'll be finished when I get enough cases, is actually a book on women in black stories, which you don't hear that much about, but I've got dozens of stories of people being visited by women in black clothes who look very pale and strange, and claim to be things like census takers, things like that. Come in the house, and then the questions get weirder. You get these strange dreams, nightmares, that kind of stuff, and it's clear that they're sort of an offshoot of the Men in Black mystery as well.
Now, the black-eyed children, that whole thing sort of creeps me out a bit. You know, and I've heard, you know, I mean, the stories of them, you know, getting in houses. I don't know what they do once they get into a house.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because I'm only actually aware of one case where they got in, and it was only for a second or two, and if I remember right, it was something like the family dog came scooting through and saw them, and then fled for its life, basically, and he'd shaken under the bed, but the black-eyed children hastily left. But for the most part, because they look so weird, you know, I mean, they're totally white-skinned, And, of course, the name is derived from the fact that their entire eyes are black, not just the center part, but the white part of the eye is black as well. So people don't let them in. But what's interesting is that they don't seem to have the power of, like, mind control that the men in black do and the women in black have, where they're literally able to force the person to open the door and let them in. The person in the black-eyed children cases retains control over their mind. It's as if the black-eyed children don't have the power to sort of place them into that sort of hypnotic state.
They're just apprentices.
Yeah, exactly. They're sort of learning the job, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, someone on the chat room wants to know, what is the most recent report you have of Men in Black, and how recent would that be?
That would either have been late 2014 or early 2015, and it was a woman who's had ongoing encounters with the Men in Black and male interference and people turning up on the doorstep claiming to be, selling things and not actually census takers, but kind of that sort of thing masquerading as something else. And she's been actually telling me her stories for probably about 2.5 years, and she's had abduction cases and a lot of weird things like this, and but she's also had ongoing Men in Black encounters and male interference, the whole thing, helicopters, and so yeah, I mean, I've got reports going up to pretty much the present day, certainly the latter part of 2014, if not early 2015, and I've got reports. The earliest report I've got from someone who's still living is the 1940s. Somebody had this is the early 40s, before even the term flying saucer was created. And I've even got some reports. There's a fascinating story from an old English newspaper from the northeast of England, where in the early 1910s, the local newspaper reported how a bunch of guys were taking a break from work, and this black car, one of the first cars in the UK, like 100 years ago, pulled up next to them, and 3 guys in black suits got out and asked them if they'd seen any strange airships flying over, like, Zeppelin balloons, that kind of thing. And they said no, and these 3 men just looked at them in a weird fashion, got in the car and drove off. That sounds just like an early MIB report. So, they go back a long, long time, and they're still going on now.
Okay, so if you're listening live, and you just came in, we're on with Nick Redfern. Currently, we're talking about Men in Black, and if you'd like to jump in the chat room, it's at podcastufo.com and ask a question. You can call in as well at 603-967-4030. Now, on these cases of Men in Black, has anyone looked to see if it's more suburban, urban? Where do these cases happen mostly? Does that matter at all?
Yeah, actually, you do find differences. For example, a lot of the women in black cases I've got are in more sort of isolated places, like farmhouses or little villages and very small towns. The Men in Black ones seem to be sort of more populated towns. For example, in the 1960s, when you had the whole Mothman thing break out at Point Pleasant, West Virginia, Point Pleasant isn't a big town, but it's not, just some place you're going to drive through in 30 seconds with a gas station and a bar and that's it. It's a substantial size. And they had a lot of Men in Black reports in that area, but I've got a lot of women in black stories from that area, from people who live like on the fringes, on the rural areas, in the farmhouses on the edge of town. And so why that should be the case, I don't know. But one of the interesting things that sort of brings to mind, I mentioned about how sometimes the women in black turn up and claim to be census takers. I've actually spoken to a number of people who had weird visits from people who claimed to be census takers, and they didn't actually give it a thought that, a year earlier or something, they'd seen a UFO. They just remembered that once, this really weird census taker turned up, but I had to get rid of him. And when I pointed out, well, this is like a classic aspect of the Men in Black and the Women in Black mystery, they masquerade as people like census takers, or, they're trying to sell you this or trying to sell that, but they're very vague about it, then they really, like a chill goes through them, because they realise, wow, what you're describing is what I saw, but I didn't make the connection with UFOs because perhaps the time frame was so long after. They didn't realise there was a connection, that there were even such things as women in black. So, but that, again, to get back to the point, I'm not sure really why, we should have different types of men in black or women in black at different places. But there's no doubt, at least in the cases that I've got, I can't speak for other people, but I do get more women in black stories from, farmhouses, out-of-the-way cottages, little tiny areas, things like that.
Wow. Now, is this a worldwide phenomenon?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the classic example, the caller, forget his name, sorry, from England who called in.
No, the call-in was Matthew. He's from the U.S.
He's in the chat room, yeah.
Oh, yeah, the chat room, yeah.
Yeah. When he was talking about, the British cases, driving Jaguar cars and Cadillacs over here. Yeah, there's a lot of British cases of the men in black. A very weird one, actually, investigated by a British researcher named Jenny Randalls from the early 1980s, where a guy had a UFO sighting. It was actually nothing that strange. It was like a light in the sky, literally nothing more than that. And he then found himself monitored and watched and shadowed by these sort of creepy men in black who would park outside his house late at night. On one occasion, he called the police, and the police came out and patrolled around, didn't see the car for a couple of nights, but then one night it turned up. The police officers apparently got out the car, walked towards the car that the men in black were in, and it literally sort of dematerialized, and they refused to report it. They're like, we're just not going to report this. How can we report it? So that's like a weird one from the UK. As you mentioned earlier, I've done a lot of expeditions and research into the Chupacabra. Well, when I went there in 2005 with a Canadian company called Red Star Films, we interviewed a farmer whose animals had been attacked. His farm animals had been attacked by what he thought was a Chupacabra. The very next day, a man and a woman turned up at his farm and grilled him all about his experience. And he was actually, literally grilled on his front doorstep and interrogated by this man and woman who looked pale, emotionless. And bearing in mind, in the summer in Puerto Rico, it's blistering hot, and they were there in the typical black suit, and the woman had like a black, businesswoman suit on, and they just reeled these questions off, and when they were satisfied, they walked off into the El Yunque rainforest. And I actually discussed this. My most recent trip to Puerto Rico was the subject of a new show on the Travel Channel just recently called Mysteries at the National Parks. And although it's not broadcast right now, it went off about 2 weeks ago, the episode is on YouTube. So if you type in Mysteries at the National Parks plus Chupacabra, you'll see this recent interview I did for this new show. And we actually talk about that man in black and woman in black encounter, and they actually recreated in the show quite skillfully. So in other words, we've got them coming, never mind the US or the UK, we've got them surfacing in Puerto Rico's El Yunque rainforest of all places. But I've got reports from Mexico, Spain, Canada, parts of South America, Australia has a lot of reports. Wherever there are UFOs at some point or another, you can pretty much guarantee there's been men in black reports as well.
How about any Asian countries?
I'm not sure I actually have any from Asian countries at all. I don't know why that would be the case, but I'm pretty sure I don't have any, no.
Yeah. My next question was, is if yes, did they still look like the typical, one that people are reporting here with the pasty white face and all that?
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because Brad Steiger, particularly in the 60s, Brad got quite a few reports of people who said the men in black that they saw actually looked Asian-like. he got a lot of stories like that in the 60s, and one of his friends on a visit to London was actually approached by three of these creepy little Asian-looking guys and one of them walked over to Brad's friend and said, "You're a friend of Brad Steiger, aren't you?" And he's like, "Well, yes." Just startled to be asked this question on the street in London. And the man in black, this Asian-looking man in black, said, "Tell him we'll meet him at Christmas time," which kind of sounded ominous. Fortunately, nothing happened, but it was sort of a weird story that Brad, never forgot. But, yeah, he's got a number of stories like that of Asian-looking men in black. But the weird thing is I can't think of any stories I actually have that came from Asia.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that, sometimes someone will see a UFO like way ahead of time, like maybe a year or whatever it is, so months ahead of time, and then they'll show up afterwards. How about when something is ongoing or something is, just happened, like that day type of thing? Does that ever happen?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's actually one of the weirdest things about the Men in Black reports. Very often they occur, or the encounters occur, when the person involved hasn't told anyone. They might not even have told a family member. Now, you could say maybe some cases are hoaxes where a person's contacted the local newspaper and the newspaper's printed the story and they've said, Mrs. Smith of whichever street, said she saw a UFO. You could understand that occasionally somebody might decide to pull a prank and turn up outside her house and start flashing lights and whatever just to spook the person, But there are a lot of reports where the person kept the story totally to themselves, didn't tell, obviously, the press or their employers, didn't even tell family members or friends for fear of ridicule. And yet they still got the knock on the door sort of within 12, 24, 48 hours. And the Men in Black knew where they'd had the encounter, when it occurred, what happened, and essentially asked them what they thought of the experience, were they going to tell anybody, and gave them reasons why it would not be good to tell anyone because, they would say things like, well, accidents can happen, that kind of thing. So how they know, I wish I had an answer. I don't know, but I can tell you for sure there is a pattern that they seem to have advance notice of, what has happened, even though the person hasn't spoken about it.
Wow. Let's see. We have a question up on the message board. Are there more daytime or night encounters?
Oh, yeah.
With the Men in Black.
Yeah. Now, there's definitely more nighttime ones. And for me, I think the main reason is because that gives the Men in Black like a significant amount of camouflage.
You did mention that earlier.
People around, less people around at night. And particularly if it's in a rural or a small town environment, if you haven't got like a lot of street lamps in the area, it's really dark. I mean, you only have to know what it's like when there's a power outage, and you realize actually how black the night sky is when you don't have all the light pollution from the town you're in or the street you're in. It's like you are plunged into darkness. And so I think the nighttime, the really not late nighttime visits are done specifically for that reason, to allow the Men in Black to arrive, to get out, do whatever they're going to do. And so, that probably explains why there's less reports in the day, because, they're wearing black suits, black fedoras. They would stand out more. That's presuming it isn't sort of a holographic thing. And so, if there's a reason for that, I think that is the reason. I don't think it's done for effect. It's nighttime, so it seems more, sort of atmospheric. I think it does come down to the angle of, camouflage, and probably just only camouflage as well. Okay. Now, the same person's also asking, do they ever encounter people in places other than their homes, like at work or public transportation, places like that? Oh, yeah. I mean, a classic example, probably the one man who really kicked off the Men in Black mystery in the early 40s is a guy named Albert Bender who lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut. he created a group in the early 50s called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, and his group really took off massively. You know, he published this little newsletter, and he soon found himself selling thousands of copies a month all around the world. The group really became a big thing. And Bender had a lot of visitations at home from these weirder-looking men in black, like the shadow people. They look ghostly and shadowy, and they would materialize in his bedroom, and there would be this overpowering brimstone smell. Well, they warned him to keep away from the subject, and Bender basically said, yes, I will stay away from it. And when they left, he essentially gave them the middle finger and didn't leave it behind. You know, he carried on with it. And he found that the more he dabbled in it, the more he would see the men in black. For example, he was kind of a solitary character, and this is like the early 50s, and he used to spend his Saturday nights going to the local theatre to watch new movies alone. And he said when he'd be sitting in the theatre and the lights were down, he would see these men in black materialise in the theatre, sort of in the shadows, and they would have these sort of burning, glowing, penetrating eyes staring at him malevolently. And he said even on his walk home, he would see them sort of hanging around in the alleyways or following him at a distance of like 100 feet, you know, and he could just see them like looming in the shadows. And it sort of terrified him, and he did eventually leave the subject. But he saw them, as I said, in the shadows of the streets, following him in the recesses in the theatre. Other people have said they've seen them. They've been driving home from work or something. The men in black, it's almost as if they anticipate, they know where the person's going to be, and they're stood at the side of the road, staring at the car as the person drives past. There are a lot of reports like that. And also where people have got weird phone calls from the men in black when they're not at home. You know, they've visited a friend and the phone call has been made there. So you've got all those kind of things as well.
Wow, weird. So what about the tie-in with the abductees? Is there one?
Well, I mean, yeah, there is, in the sense that a lot of people who've had abduction-type experiences or in the UFO abduction field have been visited by the men in black. Now, to give you one good example, a good friend of mine in California, Greg Bishop, I don't know if you know Greg, but Greg's been involved in the UFO subject for many years, like 20 years or so, perhaps a bit more than that. And in the 1990s, early 1990s, he corresponded a great deal with the alien abduction researcher Carla Turner. And Carla Turner, unfortunately, died early from cancer in the 1990s. And bear in mind, this was the early 90s, so most of the correspondence that Greg and Carla had between each other was by, old-fashioned snail mail rather than, internet, which was just in its early years then. And bear in mind that Carla was one of the leading figures in abduction research at the time. What happened was that whenever Greg and Carla would correspond with each other, the mail that, one sent to the other would arrive torn open and resealed with tape. And it was done in a fashion to clearly make it obvious to the person that it had been opened and resealed, as if to say, hey, we're reading your mail. And Greg also found himself on one occasion where a car pulled up outside his house. Some guy in black got out, quickly photographed his house and drove off. And this was all at the height of when he was liaising with Carla Turner, and they were discussing strong, good, solid abduction stories. There are also stories of abductees themselves, never mind just the researchers, having sort of follow-up visits from the men in black after their abduction encounters. But I've actually got a couple of stories as well of what sound suspiciously like women in black on board UFOs during abductions, and the women in black seem to be just sort of standing there almost overseeing the events. Wow.
Crazy stuff. Now, I know you mentioned earlier what people are, people's thoughts are on what the men in black could be, maybe a hologram or something projected into the mind or whatever like that. But what do you think they are?
Yeah, first I'll tell you what I don't think they are. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of the men in black, are not government agents. However, Where I think it gets slightly confusing is that there are a few cases where I think the government or a government agency knows all about this weirder aspect. They know these weirder men in black exist. They probably don't know what they are, but I think there's good evidence in a couple of cases they may actually have mimicked the real men in black. In other words, they may have deliberately dressed up in the old suits and the hats, and they may have done so to cover their tracks. You know, it's a case of, well, we don't know who these weirder men in black are, but we can actually use them as camouflage to cover our tracks. So that's what gets confusing. But that's only a small percentage. The vast majority, as I said, are not anything along those lines. My personal view is that however we define the world of the supernatural or the paranormal, I think that's where they come from, because they don't just, as I said, turn up in Men in Black cases. As I said, there are cases where people have been dabbling with Ouija boards and, you know, trying to summon up occults and paranormal entities, and possibly like opened a portal or a doorway. You know, although a lot of what I do is UFO and cryptozoology, I've done enough research and probably dabbled in things I shouldn't have done that lead me to believe if you know how to do it, you follow certain rituals and rites, we can open portals to other realms, which, you know, there's things there that nobody should be messing with. And the Men in Black turn up in those cases. There are a couple of famous cases from Loch Ness where people saw Loch Ness monsters, and they were visited by Men in Black, as strange as it sounds. Even Bigfoot cases. A friend of mine, Stan Gordon, has documented in his book Silent Invasion a wave of very weird paranormal-type Bigfoot activity in Pennsylvania in 1973. A number of those witnesses were visited by Men in Black as well. So the Men in Black turn up in a wide and varied range of just such strange, odd phenomena. And you have these other overtones, like the vampire parallels, the smell of brimstone in the person's house, the poltergeist activity of furniture moving after the Men in Black have left. You know, I can't reconcile that with government people, obviously. And it's hard to place all of that kind of stuff into just a category where it's aliens, where it's just nuts and bolts craft. There's something more sort of almost like esoteric and ancient and almost magical about it, magical in a sinister way rather than, you know, pulling rabbits out of a hat fashion. So that's my view. I think they're supernatural in some way, but I'd be the first to admit defining what the supernatural is you know, another whole kettle of fish as well.
Well, since the movies came out, Men in Black, like you said, with Will Smith, since those came out, do you think that their reports are on the rise, or do you think it was about the same? Do you have any idea?
Actually, no. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's increased the reports of modern-day cases, but certainly the movie, from my experience at least, definitely prompted people who'd had earlier encounters to come forward and say, hey, you know, I never realized this was a real phenomenon. I saw the movie and then realized, wow, that's what I experienced. So the movie did a good thing in the sense it did encourage people to come forward. But what I find interesting is that despite the fact that I got a lot of new reports, which I think were clearly prompted by the Men in Black movies, for the most part, the witnesses didn't describe characters like in the movies, like secret agents. They talked about the stranger-looking Men in Black. So I think that's encouraging, because if it was just people making it up and having seen the movies, they would have described them as like, you know, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones characters, like government people. But they didn't. You know, they described them as the anemic, white-looking, skinny, little weird guys. So to me, that's an important aspect of you know, from the movies as well.
Has anyone, as far as you know, ever taken a picture of one?
Oh, yeah, there's a few pictures knocking around. There's actually one reproduced in my book, The Real Men in Black. And this story actually goes back to 1968, and two researchers, one now dead, Jim Moseley, and Tim Beckley, who's still active on the scene today. Tim and Jim have both studied the Men in Black mystery extensively. And back in the 60s, there was a UFO couple in Jersey City, Jack and Mary Robertson, and they were sort of, you know, the go-to people in Jersey City in the 60s for UFO investigations. And one particular morning when Jack was at work, Mary looked out the apartment window and she saw this creepy-looking guy standing in the recess of a doorway opposite the building. And she described him as, he had like a long black trench coat, black hat, sunglasses, white face, and it was almost like he was in a trance, like he was zombified. He was just literally standing there staring for hours. Now, what makes this case a bit different is that, for the most part, the Men in Black turn up once and they're gone. You know, the trail goes cold. Well, Mary phoned up Tim and said, hey, one of these weird Men in Blacks outside the house this morning. And it then turned out he was there the next morning. And the next morning, and so Mary, on like the fourth day, phoned Tim and said, you know, he's been here the last 4 days. And Tim's like, well, why didn't you tell me? You know. So the following morning, if he'd been there 4 days, he might have been there for a fifth day. So Tim and Jim, who both lived in New York City, Tim drove over and picked Jim up, or vice versa, and then they drove over to Jersey City. And sure enough, as they got close to Mary and Jack's apartment, this man in black, 8:30 again in the morning, was standing in the doorway. And so Tim leaned out the window as Jim slowed the car down and snapped a picture as they went past. Bear in mind, this was Jersey City, you know, the middle of the rush hour in the morning, so they weren't able to stop, but they just sort of slowed down and cruised past and got the picture. Pulled into a side street, found a parking space eventually, jumped out and ran back. The guy was gone, nowhere to be seen at all, but they had the photo. And as I said, the picture's reproduced in the book, and you can find it online as well. And it's a bit grainy and blurry. Well, not so much blurry, it's more grainy. But if you blow it up, you can see the guy does look weird. You can see he's got like this vacant look on his face, even though he's got sunglasses on. You can tell it's like he's staring into the distance, and he looks totally out of place with his clothing and just standing in the recess of the door. And but that's one of probably about 5 or 6 photographs I've either got or seen of a man in black.
Wow. You know, we have about somewhere around 10 minutes left, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about any upcoming books. I know you said you do have this one that you're working on,
yeah.
The Men in Black, but any other books you'd like to talk about?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just so people understand, I'm actually with several different publishers like Llewellyn, Visible Ink Press, and New Page, and, you know, they're all fine about me doing books for the different publishers, providing you're not doing one on exactly the same subject, you know, where it's in competition. So the Bloodline of the Gods book comes out with New Page Books. Then I've got this book, Chupacabra Road Trip, which is a sort of very different book. My big interest is cryptozoology, the study of unknown animals. And Chupacabra Road Trip, as sort of the name suggests, it's like a 10-year diary-type book of me running around, racing around Puerto Rico, investigating the Chupacabra on various expeditions covering 2014 to the present day, as well as expedition to Mexico and various parts of the U.S. And because it's sort of written in road trip style, you know, it's written as things happen. So, you know, it's like the morning chasing the Chupacabra and then hacking through the rainforest in the afternoon, then cooling off with a cold beer in the evening in the bar and interviewing a witness there, that kind of thing. So it's, you know, it's sort of like a typical road trip, and that one will be out in about a week, but it may actually be already out despite the official release date. And the other one is the Men in Black book. It's actually coming out through my agent's company, Lisa Hagen Books, and that'll be out in about 2 weeks. And that's like a combination of, as I said earlier, there's about 30 to 40 entries in the book. Roughly half of them are never-before-seen reports on Men in Black cases in the witness's own words. And the others are papers from leading people in the UFO field on the Men in Black. So there's a paper from Brad Steiger, who I mentioned earlier, David Weatherly, who's written the definitive book on the black-eyed children. David submitted a paper for the book on the parallels and crossovers between and similarities between the Men in Black and the black-eyed children. Jason Offutt is talking about the shadow people and, you know, the the MIB angles there. And there's a variety of other people. So it's sort of like a good cross-section of papers and witness testimony, new cases, and sometimes old cases, but which the person has never really wanted to speak out before. And again, a lot of those stories are very weird. Some of them are the Hat Man and Shadow People variety. Others seem to sort of give warnings of death and all sorts of sort of sinister stuff that, again, there's no way you can reconcile that with, some guy from the Pentagon or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the books you've written in the past is Secrets of Mount Shasta. And I lived, about 3 or 4 hours south of there. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I used to go vacation for a couple of days up there. I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And there was something, there's 2 places in this country that I've been that I felt kind of like weird feelings about. One of them is Four Corners, and I don't know why. And another one was Mount Shasta, and beautiful, beautiful area. But can you talk a little bit about the in a nutshell? We have about 6.5 minutes or something like that left, and kind of a nutshell about that book.
Yeah, sure. Well, that one, Secrets of Mount Shasta, was actually one where, kind of like with me and the Men in Black, the new Men in Black book, a number of us sort of submitted material for it. So, it came out under multiple names. But my submission was on some of the weirdest stuff I'd investigated from Mount Shasta, which included sort of classic flying saucer type sightings and contactee cases in the late 40s and early 50s. Bigfoot reports from Mount Shasta, and stories of Bigfoot creatures reportedly coming out of caves on Mount Shasta, and also reports of what sounded like ancient humanoids, the idea of sort of ancient terrestrial human races living out, deep within the cavernous areas of Mount Shasta. A lot of legends like that of supposedly, we don't know where the truth begins and the legend ends and vice versa, but there are stories about supposedly the ancient Atlanteans, after Atlantis was destroyed, supposedly making their way to Mount Shasta and living in cavernous, massive, hollowed-out areas beneath Mount Shasta. If you know the way in, you could access them. So a lot of weird stories coming out of Mount Shasta. But it's interesting what you said about certain areas creating a creepy vibe. One place where I got that in California was a place called Devil's Gate Dam in Pasadena, California. That has a lot of strange stuff to it. Jack Parsons, one of the U.S. military's early rocket pioneers, who was also a follower of Aleister Crowley and somebody who dabbled in a lot of occult rituals and things like this and blew himself up in his lab, which may not have been coincidence. It could have been a kind of psychic backlash. He helped found the Jet Propulsion Lab at Devil's Gate Dam, or just right next to it. And there have been a lot of weird creature sightings at Devil's Gate Dam. Also, reports of suicides. There's a bridge just down the road from the dam itself, which is known locally as Suicide Bridge, because so many people have thrown themselves off the bridge, literally dozens, since the turn of the 20th century. And when you go there, it's like you go to Pasadena and you go down this little side path, and you're into this area about 100 feet below the main road level, and it's sort of encased in woodland, and you're in almost like a little world all of its own, and it has a really weird, creepy vibe. It's almost, you can tell that there's something wrong about the area. You can just sort of almost taste the atmosphere of it.
Yes, there was one other place I felt that also, and that was through sort of the Dulce area of New Mexico, and that whole after you go through that mountain pass, that was just another weird feeling. And it has nothing to do, this was back in the 70s, but I just remember that feeling. Now, I saw that you had a book actually in 2012, The World's Weirdest Places, kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, actually, Mount Shasta's in there, and actually the reason that reminded me of the Devil's Gate Dam thing is because there's a chapter on that in there as well. When you mentioned Mount Shasta, that reminded me, from my perspective, that was a weird place. But, you can find a lot of places around the world like that have a strange vibe and atmosphere. But on top of that, they're filled with a lot of weird stuff that seems, initially at least, unconnected. But in a lot of these sort of window areas, as John Keel used to call them, you have, Bigfoot reports, UFOs, ghosts, paranormal phenomena, and it seems all separate, but it's all focused on one little town or, one area of forest, a small forest or a small woodland. People like John Keel speculated that these so-called window areas might be sort of portals to other realms of existence, and that's why we see so much weirdness in these places, because they literally use these portals to access our reality before returning to their own reality or dimension.
Wow. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and let's see. I wanted to ask you, you have a website, and you also have a blog site, so you're always writing, aren't you?
But yeah, I have a blog, which is if people Google Nick Redfern World of Whatever, that'll throw up the blog address, and I also write for the website Mysterious Universe. I do a couple of articles for them every couple of days, and people can also reach me on Facebook or Twitter. Just type my name and, they'll find me. And, I'm always happy to chat with people if they want advice on anything or if they've got questions they want answering, or if they want to share information. It's like I said, a lot of people, particularly with the men in black and the women in black, they have these experiences and they have a strange experience with a census taker. I've found a lot of times I've done radio and people are like, wow, that was me, and I didn't realize that is what would be classed as a man in black. It's only afterwards when, people talk about them that they then realize what happened. So, yeah, if anybody's got information they want to share or, they want questions answering or help or advice, I'm always happy to chat. I feel it's important to make a link with the readers. You don't want to, no pun intended, alienate them. They bought the book. They've spent the time to contact me. The very least I can do is, help them if I can with any questions they might have or whatever.
Yep, well, that's it, Nick. Thanks so much.
All right, well, thank you.
And so I want to thank everyone for helping out with the show. Keith Rowland for producing the radio end of this. I want to thank Alejandro Rojas, our guest, of course. Nick Redfern, thank you. Next week, we have... who do we have next week? Boy, I am at a total loss. We do have a guest for next week. He's a good old guy. He's been around. Don Eckhart. He'll be on. And let's see. We're running out of time, so we got to go. So thanks a lot, everyone. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.